have a few quick reminders, which I'm sure Chell is probably posting, and you will, but just to remind you that if you're seeking CLE credit for this program, there will be 2 code words given throughout the program that you must include in your affidavit and submit to Lisa Rivage per the instructions in order to get your credit. Finally, we do hope to save some time for questions and answers after the panel discussion and before we close the program. The chat room will be closed as Chell indicated, but you can submit questions ahead of time if you wish in the Q&A box on your Zoom screen. So with that, I am going to now turn it over to Professor Ayers to begin the panel discussion.
Thank you so much, Judge, and thank you so much to everybody who's joined us. As I look at the list of attendees, I see some folks that I know and haven't seen in a while. It's great to see you, and I see folks I don't know, and it's great to meet you. So I'm extremely happy to be here. I'm very, very grateful to Chell and Judge Stein and everybody at the Government Law Center for organizing this program. And super grateful to our panelists for joining me. Everybody here is somebody I'm really excited to talk to and learn from. I thought that in order to get things started, rather than going through everybody's bio at the same time, I would introduce the panelists as I call on them for a sort of opening round of thoughts. And the theme of this panel is the future of legal rights and protections. And so the question for all of these folks who've worked in so many different areas affecting trans and gender non-conforming and intersex folk is just in a particular area where you have expertise, what do you see as the future of that area? What are your hopes? What are your fears? Or what do you think is important for folks to know? So I wanted to start with Shain Filcher, and Shain is the executive director of the LGBT Bar Association of New York. They've also served as staff attorney in the LGBTQ plus legal project at Legal Services of the Hudson Valley. And so Shain is somebody with a lot of experience with direct services for LGBTQ folks. What do you think about the future of that world?
Well, thank you for that warm introduction, and thank you so much for including me on today's panel. It sounds like it's been quite the exciting trio of conversations, so I'm excited that we're able to round that out today. So thinking in terms of direct services, I'm definitely not going to organize my thoughts chronologically here, so bear with me. I'm going to be kind of ping-ponging back and forth between immediate and more long-term future perspectives. But when I was thinking about that question, there was kind of 3 key points that came to mind for me. First of which being moving beyond an era of firsts and onlys. Second of which adding more trans and intersex people in the law. And third of which being just honestly bringing more everyday dignity for all of us, depending on practicing law or not. I don't even care at that point. So let me kind of flush each of those out a little bit further. So in our immediate future, we're really thinking about preventing rollbacks and protecting the gains. I don't want to be overly political here, but we do have potential important decisions coming up in the upcoming and subsequent Supreme Court terms that could make decisions regarding so-called conversion therapy, access to bathrooms in schools, and gender-affirming healthcare for minors. We're also coming up on an election year. So in the very immediate future, of course, I would be remiss if I didn't call upon some of the things that are going on nationally in the bigger picture. But back to the 3 points that I wanted to focus on for our opening remarks. Oftentimes at direct services, you will see maybe one LGBTQ plus job at an organization. And when I'm thinking through the big, beautiful, diverse umbrella that the trans community is, if you have someone there who is just transmasc or just non-binary or just trans femme, only one of those identities, we all have very different experiences and needs. So it's important to be able to bring in as many lived experiences as possible. And you really can't do that if there's only one position at an organization to serve all LGBTQ plus people. And that's assuming they even get a trans person to staff that job. You know, for example, my own experience getting a name change, applying for a court-ordered legal name change during the pandemic is going to be very different from somebody who did theirs prior to the pandemic, or even now, or 2 or 3 years from now. So part of moving beyond that first and only is making sure that there isn't only one of these types of positions at key organizations that are working with folks in the community, and thinking about how we can reimagine funding for nonprofit organizations, because there are so many restrictions around, frankly, working with incarcerated people and talking about or working within the reproductive rights justice movement, that these restrictions not only overlap with our own work that we're doing, but they also hold back our movement. So similar along those lines, we need to see more trans and intersex people in the law, and that's something that I work towards and I'm very passionate about in my current position as executive director of the LGBT Bar Association of Greater New York. And we need to see more of our community members as court users, as court staff, as judges like Judge Marnin, and as an attorneys. And some of the examples that come out of that are included in your resource material packet, such as the bench card to help educate judges on how to work with LGBTQ plus court users, staff, colleagues, and attorneys, and an ethics opinion if you are advocating on behalf of somebody, that to ensure that their pronouns are respected regardless of their identity. And even just, personally, recently, I've had the experience filing things pro se in court where 2 clerks were arguing in front of me about the contents of the paperwork, but they were also arguing within that conversation about me, what pronouns to use. One was adamantly he, him, and one was adamantly she, her. And well, first of all, you're both wrong. But that was, that was an uncomfortable moment. And things like that shake public confidence, frankly, in individual legal institutions and the rule of law itself. So it is so important to be bringing more trans people, more intersex people into the court system, into the legal system. And I will continue to work in my day-to-day job to build out that pipeline from pre-law to the bench. Part of that was yesterday, I'm happy to report that I was in Washington, D.C. at the Supreme Court being sworn in as a member of that bar. So all 9 of those judges had to look at 12 openly transgender and non-binary attorneys being admitted to practice. And that is important, that we were there in person instead of just swearing in on the papers, so that they know that we exist and that we're thriving and surviving and practicing law. Now, I will say, disappointingly, the oral arguments that proceeded to follow the swearing had some conversational pieces about dress codes and single-sex bathrooms not being particularly controversial. And I will say dress codes tied to gender, stereotypes not being necessarily controversial. So as we know, there's still so much work to be done, and visibility is just that first step. So that kind of ties into, again, fighting for the everyday dignity for all of us, whether or not we are somebody who is in the legal movement or not. We want to be pushing back against the pervasive talking points that are troubling to hear are creeping into the legal profession. And some of these talking points are misinformed at best and downright hateful at worst. We want to be thinking and continuing to talk about access to healthcare. It is hard enough getting to the point of obtaining a legal prescription for testosterone, frankly, that the widespread reports from across New York State of trans, masc, and non-binary people across socioeconomic categories being unable to fill their hard-fought obtained prescriptions should just never be written off as something that's okay for now. And even, personally traveling back and forth between DC and New York across this week, I will say that the couple on the Amtrak train when I went down to DC was just visibly uncomfortable to be seated next to me, and to, just the way I was presenting and what was open on my browser, because I brought my work with me to be working on the train, and they figured out what was what real quick, and they were not okay with that. And one of them even changed seats. So, just kind of having like those everyday micro or macro aggressions, it is something that we need to continue to push back against and engage our allies around, and remind everyone that we are not a wedge issue. We are people, and we are so much more than our gender identities. So that, I think that's kind of where I wanted to start us off for opening remarks. But happy
Great. Thank you so much. And I really connect with what you say about the importance of representation of different kinds of trans folk, people with different experiences. I often say that, as a transgender person, I can speak from my own experience, but I think a lot of people who aren't who haven't met a lot of trans folk are surprised by the extent to which Yeah, there's a saying I heard somewhere: if you've met one trans person, you've met one trans person. You know, it doesn't mean that you have a sense of what the trans experience is. Let me just ask before I move along, just for assuming zero knowledge from our audience, who I'm sure have a very diverse range of experiences themselves. When you use terms like transmasc and transfemme, could you explain what those mean?
I really hate to commit to a textbook
Sure, sure,
definition
sure,
of
sure.
anyone's sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. So really, I am just kind of using that as an umbrella of somebody who is more femme of center and may also resonate with woman, or someone who is more masculine of center and may or may not resonate with man. And really, that is just the broader umbrella. So.
Yeah. No, that's great, and I didn't mean to put you on the spot. For definitions are hard. Okay, thank you so much, Shain. So now I want to move to our next panelist, Melissa Sklarz. Melissa is government relations liaison at Equality New York. She has extensive experience in government and advocating for LGBTQ communities, and has been a leader in transgender rights advocacy since the late 90s. Before joining Equality New York, she was senior government relations strategist at SAGE, providing advocacy and services for LGBT elders. And she's also been the director of development at the Transgender Legal Defense and Education Fund. So, Melissa, I want to call on you to talk about the importance of and the future of LGBTQ inclusive curriculums or curricula. I honestly have no idea what the correct plural is, but anyway, your thoughts.
Thank you, Professor Aver. It's lovely to be here today. Thank you, Albany Law School. So the good news is I have long, many years, decades of experience. The bad news is our culture changes so rapidly that it's important that I be here today to recognize that there are new ideas that are percolating all the time. And it's important to have an open mind because it's a great way for us to learn things. My resume goes back to arguing with Mayor Rudy Giuliani in New York in the late 1990s on why language that protects gay and lesbian people may not protect transgender people in New York City. Once he was replaced by Michael Bloomberg, our law went into effect, and then we went to Albany, figuring it would take forever, and it only took 18 years, which is not bad. And so we've discovered something. We're here today. We are all students of law, whether specific or generally. And I've been involved in trying to make sure that we have grown our coalition to make sure that we have educated as many people as possible to all the different needs of what used to be trans people and is now TGNCI and B people. And as our umbrella broadens, the needs also enlarge. The funny thing is that we all assume that visibility is a good thing, but here's what happens with visibility: is the more we are out and open and authentic, the enemies, the anti-equality enemies, come up with new ideas to prevent us from taking our place among others. And the amount of pushback that we've seen from a vibrant trans community outside of New York has been, for me, astonishing. It is so unexpected. But we're not here for a political polemic. We're going to talk about New York, what's happening in New York. I always thought that changing the law was the ultimate way to move our culture forward. And now I've discovered that if people are not engaged with these ideas that we are changing and protecting in court, it becomes problematic. I mean, the Supreme Court says that abortion is important and necessary and should be legal, and yet the anti-abortion enemies spent decades to come up with it and creating all these talking points, most of which are false. And now it's become controversial again. So things that were not controversial 40 years ago are controversial today. Trans identity is the same. And the way to alleviate that is to have LGBT and trans-specific curriculum in our schools. And what would happen if young people are not so ostracized. All of us have experience in school. Me, I am older than dirt, so all those terrible LGBT stories, really, I predate all of that. Both Glisten and the Trevor Project have done a variety of um, programs on this, and the numbers are terrifying and startling about youth suicide, about harassment, about violence. It's unbelievable where kids go to school, kids don't go to school because it's too dangerous. The bullying. You can go to both Trevor Project and Glisten and see some. There were studies done in 2019 and 2021 on violence in schools against LGBT, and whatever gay and lesbian kids are going through, trans kids, gender non-conforming kids are going through double. 1 out of 3 LGBT kids have discrimination, 3 out of 5 trans kids, and so on and so forth. It's really important for young people to understand that there's more to LGBT and trans people than what's happening on television today, that there's a long history here in the United States and in New York. And what we want to be able to do is show that LGBT and people are, in fact, basic to the foundation of our culture and have a place here. And to not be so filled with ignorance, cliche, anger, resentment, and rage that we see. You know, our anti-equality enemies across the Hudson River have all these difficult, unfortunate talking points. I have the luxury to say I'm not convinced whether they're real or not, or if they're just trying to build a political coalition. But what we're seeing in Missouri and Florida and Arkansas are truly terrifying, where they want to make trans identity illegal, and starting with little children and work their way up to adults. My opinion is the courts will protect us, but I've always said that, and now we have a Supreme Court that is so radically different from anything we've seen, really, in almost a civil war. And our enemies know that, and so they're going to take every reactionary idea, throw it against the wall with the hope that someday our anti-equality enemies on Supreme Court will be able to rule in their favor. I think curriculum is the way to go. And of course, now I have the luxury of living here in New York City. And so we have a great deal of progressive lawmakers. We have a great deal of people that are involved and engaged. And even with that, the simple idea of bringing LGBT history to middle school and high school seems radical and controversial. There is a bill in the legislature now. It's Robert Jackson in the Senate and Danny O'Donnell in the Assembly. It's already been there for 3 years. 2024 will be 4 years. You know, we're always hopeful. Here at Equality New York, the largest advocacy group for LGBT people and their families in the state, will do everything humanly possible to move this, make sure there are public hearings. Of course, people that don't live in New York City, what they're seeing is sexualizing children. It's amazing how many times that we try to educate people on our community and how our enemies always go to this spot, that every time we talk about our community, our people, and they talk about it being grooming and sexualizing. There are a lot more of them than there are us, but what it does, it makes it hard to move these ideas forward, especially now when 2024 will be an election year. So if 2023 would be a thinking year, and yet 2024 will be an election year. But certainly that will not stop us. What we're going to be doing is building our coalition, engaging as many people as possible. Here at Equality New York, we are always hopeful and optimistic that we can move this bill and help protect our LGBT and trans kids in school, that people that are not queer identified can learn about what happens in our authentic lives and not be so afraid of the future. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Melissa. And I'm going to pause for a moment to ask Chell to share our first CLE code.
Yes, for those of you who are attorneys looking for CLE credit, your first code word is agency. You should be seeing that on your screen. That first code word is agency. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Chell. And before we move on, Melissa, let me just ask, could you say, maybe briefly, if you can, just for folks who aren't familiar with the concept, what do we mean by LGBTQ plus inclusive curriculum? You talked about, I think, very rightly about how some people think that means sexualizing kids or whatever, but what is it that you actually get when you have an LGBTQ plus inclusive curriculum?
Our community has a long history in the United States, in the world, and in New York. And a lot of young people, and let's say young people, let's say from 14 to 18, they don't really know.
Yeah.
And so the idea would be to humanize this history, and it gives people an opportunity. It also shows people that are alone and isolated. Although I got to ask the question to all of us here on the panel and out there on my computer, in the world of internet, are people as isolated as we were when I was young and there were 4 TV stations? But are people feeling isolated and alone and afraid, and they're coming perhaps from religious families where their parents have a very old-timey perspective? I think it's very, very important that people get a sense of the history, who we are as a people and a culture, just like every other people. One of the problems with our LGBTQ curriculum bill is now other communities are saying, well, if we're going to learn about LGBT people, what about our community? People should understand that we have a long history in New York too. And so these are our friends and allies, and they just want to add to their perspective. We just want to make sure that non-queer people understand that that we are here. We've been around for a long time. We do a lot of wonderful things for our American culture, and rather than be feared, we should be embraced.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And so next I want to turn to Faris Ilyas. Faris is policy counsel at the new Pride Agenda. And before they worked at the new Pride Agenda, they were a legal fellow at the Urban Justice Center, where they assisted with efforts to decriminalize sex work and to promote other reforms aimed at uplifting people in the sex trades in New York State. They also worked with the Sylvie Rivera Law Project, where they provided legal assistance to incarcerated transgender, gender non-conforming, and intersex people. And so, Faris, I would love it if you could talk to us a little bit about the future of protecting trans folk who are incarcerated.
Yeah, thank you so much to Ava and Chell for organizing this. This is such an important panel, and I'm so excited to be included in this discussion, and I'm so excited to be seeing some familiar faces on the panel as well. So as Ava was saying, I've been very proud to be able to work for organizations and coalitions that have really focused on working with and uplifting transgender communities that are some of the most invisibilized and some of the most marginalized at the Sylvia Rivera Law Project. I worked with incarcerated and formerly incarcerated transgender people. Specifically, I was helping them file name change petitions, and I was answering a lot of prison mail while I was there. And after law school, I worked for the Sex Workers Project to help decriminalize sex work. And so these are 2 communities that throughout my time working with them, I've noticed have been very invisibilized, and some of the worst forms of discrimination and violence are happening to them. And so I would really hope to see, and I think it is happening, a lot of change is going to be accomplished in New York. So starting with incarcerated transgender people, so first I just want to like zoom out and like ground us in like larger context and describe some of the circumstances about why transgender people are disproportionately incarcerated. So I believe like a survey that I recently read, it was 1 in 6 transgender Americans has been incarcerated. And the number is even greater for Black transgender people. It's 1 in 2. And that's because transgender people live at
the intersection of so many different forms of discrimination and violence, including in access to stable housing, food insecurity, inability to access stable employment, immigration. There's so many different reasons why a lot of transgender people are pushed into poverty. And while they are there, they are being over-policed. And while they are there, they're also engaging in a lot of forms of survival work, including survival sex work, which are criminalized. And so after transgender people and GNC and non-binary people are being discriminated in so many different ways that are leading them into poverty and leading them into life trajectories where they are becoming criminalized, they wind up in systems, in the prison systems and in the jail systems, where they experience some of the worst forms of violence and discrimination that trans people can encounter, including sexual assault, physical assault, on a daily basis, on a regular basis. It is their, daily reality that their pronouns will not be respected. They will not be able to simply wear the clothing that they identify with. No one will use the name that they prefer. And it's extremely dangerous to be housed with folks that, are not aligned with your gender, or to be strip searched by people who are not aligned with your gender. And so I think that there is a lot of promise happening. So there were 2 recent court cases that were won by transgender people who were formerly incarcerated, where they were able to implement like a changed policy to basically make it a requirement that, if this is in Steuben County and in Broome County, where if you're a transgender person who's incarcerated in those counties, you are presumptively housed in a facility that is aligned with your gender, unless you decide not to. And they were also able to establish better access to medical care as well in those counties. And besides that, recently there has been the introduction and reintroduction of the Gender Identity, Respect, and Dignity and Safety Act in New York, which is sponsored by Assemblymember Rosick and Senator Salazar in New York. And this is an act that would basically establish some of those same requirements in the prison and jail facilities in New York that would require transgender people and GNC people and intersex people to be housed presumptively in facilities that are aligned with their gender, unless they opt not to. And it would require correctional officers and staff who are also, besides people that they are being housed with, corrections officers and staff within prisons and jails are some of the most likely to be assaulting and hurting and just plain mistreating transgender people. It would require them to address trans people and GNC people and non-binary people by their correct names and pronouns. And it would ensure that they can be searched by staff of the same gender for their security and safety and for their comfort. And it would also guarantee access to healthcare, commissary items, clothing, and other things like programs that are consistent with their gender. And finally, a very important note is that it would limit the involuntary protective custody terms to 14 days. And very often transgender people who are victimized in prison and in jails, they are often put in protective custody to protect them. But actually, that just means they are isolated almost like their whole time. They're just isolated, and it's just solitary confinement, basically. And there's no limit to how long that they could be kept there. And it could be involuntary or voluntary. And it's the idea is that it's going to protect them, but they are often even more in danger when they are over there. And so it would limit those terms to just 14 days. And then I also wanted to move to sex workers. So again, like I mentioned a little bit earlier, many transgender people turn to different forms of work that are criminalized because of the discrimination and bias that they experience in employment and in housing. And particularly many transgender immigrant communities have been engaging in survival sex work because it's very difficult to find employment when you're a trans immigrant. And sometimes sex work is just the quickest and most stable way for you to be able to make money quickly and just, stabilize yourself. And it's a way for you to decide your own schedule. It's a way for you to decide your own rate of how much you're going to get paid. You could do it from your own home. And so it's just a form of work that is very easy and accessible for people, especially people who are dealing with homelessness and people who are immigrants. And so this is a movement that is international, and it's been growing in momentum over the last few years. And I really hope that it's going to continue to gain momentum. It's happening in different countries. So as early as the early 2000s, New Zealand has fully decriminalized sex work, meaning that you can sell sex and you can purchase sexual services and not face a criminal penalty. And there are other countries like Australia and Germany who are considering decriminalizing sex work, or who have already, in certain portions of those countries, they have decriminalized sex work. And different states are also considering the full decriminalization of sex work. And in New York, there is a bill called the Stop Violence in the Sex Trades Act that would comprehensively decriminalize sex work. And what that means is that you can sell sex in New York, or purchase sex, or collaborate with or support sex workers, and you will not face any sort of criminal penalty as a result. And what that bill would also do is provide criminal record relief for people who have already been convicted by automatically sealing past sex work related convictions. And so this is a community that has also just been really looked over, but we know that there are many, many transgender people who have done sex work at some point in their life because it has been the most stable form of work for them. I know so many sex workers who are trans currently, or have, done sex work at some point in their life and have been criminalized for doing so just because it was the best way they knew of to be able to put food on their table or to pay their rent. And this is a movement that is really led by trans people right now in New York. And so I really hope that more and more people will be focusing on these two communities.
Hey, thank you so much, Faris. And I think it's incredibly important to for folks to realize that, so often when people do hear from trans folk, which obviously they often don't at all, but if they do, it's far more often trans people who are on the relatively privileged end of the socioeconomic spectrum. I often say, I'm a law professor with a stable job, and I'm incredibly grateful for that. I can't speak for such a wide swath of the trans community that has all kinds of different experiences and issues that people may not immediately think of. So I'm really grateful to you for bringing us that perspective. Great. So now I want to ask our fourth panelist, Allie Bohm, to talk about a couple of issues. Allie is Senior Policy Counsel at the New York Civil Liberties Union, where she develops and advocates for policy solutions primarily related to LGBT equality, reproductive freedom, and privacy and technology. She previously worked as Policy Counsel for Public Knowledge, focused on privacy, and as an advocacy and policy strategist at the ACLU. So, a really wide variety of experience. And Allie, when we talked, you mentioned a couple of issues that I think are super important, the Equal Rights Amendment, and a whole group of issues around healthcare, from young people's access to care, gender affirming care, hospital transparency. I'll let you go, but as a trans person who's been talking on the phone to my insurance company yesterday, and I'll be talking to him again today, and I'll probably be writing them a letter tomorrow. And if anybody knows a good lawyer, I'm going to ask you for a recommendation. We're gonna have a lot to talk about here. So Allie, go ahead.
Professor Ayers is just letting you all know that I work on too much. Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel, and thank you all for joining us. I want to say a couple of things just at the jump, feeding off of the panelists before me. First of all, I just want to say quickly that the Steuben and Broome County cases, which were ours along with TILDEF, and in the case of Steuben County, the law firm Baker Hallstatter, I pronounce them wrong every time. I'm so sorry if one of you that's your firm. And in Broome County with Paul Weiss, those cases actually never made it to trial. Those were settlements, and you can find the settlement agreements in your packets. They are pretty similar to what the Gender Identity, Respect, Dignity, and Safety Act would do, and the New York State Sheriff's Association signed off on the one in Steuben County. So we know it's workable. There are similar policies in our peer states like California, our neighboring states like Connecticut and Massachusetts and New Jersey, and our neighbor to the north, Canada. So totally workable. Anyone who tells you it's not, they're lying to you. The second thing that I wanted to build off of was Melissa said there are a lot more of them, and by that she meant the haters, than there are of us. And as the token cis person, I don't often get to be a token cis person, but I am today on this panel. I want to say there are a lot more of us than there are of them. And by that, I mean there are a lot more folks who are aligned with trans justice and who are really strong allies than there are haters, even if the haters are really, really loud. And I know we're in a really fucking scary time. I'm so sorry I curse. I work at the CLU, free speech. Anyway, I know we are in a really scary time right now, and I don't want to minimize that. I also have been in this world just long enough to know that, I do think the arc of history bends towards justice, and not because there's any inherent, it necessarily will, but because we all lean on that arc together and push it. And, I feel privileged to be the cis person on this panel and get to say that there are a lot of cis folks who are in this fight with you all, and that feels really important, particularly in the face of what the more hostile states have been doing, and I know it's a scary time. So in terms of the things I was actually asked to talk about, right, you asked me a question. So the first piece that I was asked to talk about is the New York Equal Rights Amendment, which is a super exciting opportunity. I need to start by sharing a little bit of boilerplate language for our tax compliance purposes. The NYCLU is on the executive committee of the Ballot Initiative Committee. Yes, there are 2 committees in a row that is aiming to pass the ERA on the 2024 ballot. And I'm here today not only with my NYCLU hat on, but also as a part of New Yorkers for Equal Rights to talk with you about the ERA, which is a key trans justice priority. So right now, the New York State Constitution, like the vast majority of state constitutions, does not include explicit protections for trans folk. It also does not include explicit protections for LGBT folk, for pregnant New Yorkers, for women, for those with disabilities, for older adults, and for people from different countries and cultures. The ERA, which is the Equal Rights Amendment, would explicitly prohibit discrimination by the government based on a person's ethnicity, national origin, age, disability, and sex, including sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, in addition to pregnancy and pregnancy outcomes. I should hang a flag here. If you say hang and flag at the same time, it goes poorly, y'all. I should hang a flag here that our state constitution already protects against discrimination based on race and religion, and the ERA would add to those protections. So that's why they're not in the laundry list. They're already in our Constitution. At the time when policymakers and courts across the country are narrowing and rescinding rights, this proposal embeds explicit protections within our state constitution. I'm fairly confident that it would make us the second state to explicitly protect gender identity and sexual orientation in our state constitution. Believe it or not, that is after Nevada, which is enshrined an ERA in its state constitution in 2022. While New York has passed critical laws to fight discrimination, without the backing of our state constitution, politicians could try to roll back our fundamental rights at any time. We need a constitutional amendment that guarantees our rights and freedoms are permanently protected in the state constitution, no matter who is in office. New Yorkers will have the opportunity to vote on the ERA in 2024, and if voters approve it, the ERA will be added to our state constitution. So that's a really exciting direct democracy opportunity that is coming down the pike that would be fairly historic and fairly awesome for trans folk and a number of the rest of us here in New York. In terms of the other piece that I was asked about, which is healthcare, New York likes to position itself or likes to say that we are a beacon for gender affirming care, that we are a beacon for trans folk. And certainly that was the governor's message at the step off of New York City Pride last year when she signed a gender affirming care shield law. But we know that there's a lot more left to be done.
Allie, I'm just going to interrupt. Can you explain what you
Yeah.
mean by gender affirming shield law?
Yes, so we passed a law. Thanks for keeping me honest. We passed a law last year that would essentially ensure that the machinery of New York State will not be used to facilitate other states' criminalization or other states holding people civilly liable for providing or receiving gender affirming care here in New York, regardless of where the patient is from. So if a patient from Florida travels to New York, it would also go a long way to protecting, making sure there are no New York consequences. So think about things like licensure and med mal for providers who are providing care here in New York. And it's got a little tiny family law provision in there to make clear that supporting a trans kid is not child abuse here in New York. And I'll talk a little bit more about Shield Laws 2.0 in a couple of minutes. So, we have done a few things, but there's more that we need to do. And so I'm going to talk a little bit now and try to rattle through a lot of policy proposals in fairly short order. First of all, if we're really going to be an access state for gender affirming care, we need to make sure that patients know where they can get care. Right now, hospitals across the state deny care for policy-based reasons. So that's not, we don't have a qualified provider, or we don't have open beds, or your insurance doesn't cover it. That's, we don't treat people like this here. Our bureaucrats have said, we provide hysterectomies to cisgender women with cancer, but we don't provide it to trans men with gender dysphoria. Or, and this is a true story from a human being who contacted us, we don't provide bottom surgery to intersex patients. Why? I don't know. But right now it's because hospitals' policies are often shrouded in secrecy, it's really hard for patients to know whether the hospital in their area provides the care they need prior to admission, prior to trying to make an appointment. Sometimes folks actually end up at an appointment and find out they can't get the care they need. And so what the Hospital Transparency Bill would do, it's S 1003, that is how we read those numbers, A, and A 733A, it is a Hinchy-Rosick bill, is it would require the State Department of Health to collect information from each general hospital about their policy-based exclusions. And the department would then need to publish that information publicly on its hospital comparison tool so that people could see, oh, this hospital doesn't provide. And it's both, and I should just step back and say, when I say policy-based exclusions, I mean, we don't provide this care full stop. And you might think about that as like, we don't provide abortions, right? Or we don't provide it to this category of people. And those were the other examples that I provided earlier. Side note, though we don't provide to this category of people is already against the law. However, that isn't stopping hospitals from doing it. And we know that it causes people a lot of trouble when they're running around on the phone or physically trying to seek care. So would let humans know would also be a tool for producing a report to the state so that the state can identify where particular types of care are not available at all, where are their healthcare deserts, and can do future policy making to patch those deserts and make sure that everyone can receive the care they need in their own communities. We also need to protect patient privacy. So as we know, our electronic data, right, the data that from our purchase history, from our social media, from our phone records, from our location information, because this is a giant tracking device, say a lot about what's going on and about our health, right? So if people are buying different clothes, for example, or people are filling prescriptions for testosterone, all of that, could get revealed by your electronic history. And so we need to pass health data privacy to make sure that we're in charge of that information, and that information, when it pertains to healthcare, to our health status, or to the health status of, or to our seeking of healthcare, or to the health status or seeking of healthcare for other people who have come to New York in New York, is protected, and that we're in charge of it, in charge of what happens to it, and that it can't be used to criminalize people. So, limiting law enforcement access to it. And so that a bill that would do that is the Health Data Privacy Bill, which is S 158B A 4983B, and that's Senator Kruger and Assemblymember Linda Rosenthal bill. I will say both of the bills I just talked about passed the Senate last year. Hospital transparency got all the way to the Assembly floor calendar and died on the vine, breaking my heart. So we are hoping the Assembly will do better on both of these bills in the coming session, and that we'll get them over the finish line. We also need to make sure that everyone who needs healthcare can get the care that they need. And one of the concerns that we've received a bunch of intakes on is young people. So in New York, we recognize that people need access to healthcare and that people can't always involve parents in those decisions. And so New York allows young people, decisionally capable young people, to consent to certain types of healthcare. So all decisionally capable young people can consent to HIV testing and treatment, STI testing and treatment, abortion, prenatal care, substance abuse treatment in certain settings, mental health treatment in certain, mental health counseling in certain settings. And some young people categorically can consent to all of their own healthcare if they're decisionally capable. So those are young people who are parents, young people who are married, young people who are in the military, young people who are incarcerated in adult facilities. I hope that is a small set. Young people who are emancipated. Side note, New York does not have an emancipation process. So it's a bit of a fictitious category. And as of this past year, young people who are homeless or who are runaway and receiving services from a homeless and runaway youth service program. That one is super exciting for our community because a disproportionate percentage of young people who are homeless and runaway are LGBTQ, and many of them have been pushed out of their homes. But there is a bill pending that would allow all decisionally, would patch holes in that system. Because as I said, we're receiving intakes. Can this young person consent to gender affirming care? They don't have a parent available to consent for them, or they don't have a parent who's willing, but they are decisionally capable. The answer is they can consent to talk therapy in certain settings, but they can't consent to blockers. They can't consent to hormones. They can't consent until they turn 18. It's a huge issue. There are other types of care that young people can't consent to as well. COVID vaccines, for example. And we recognized that running bills specifically on gender affirming care or specifically on vaccines, or you get the idea, might be a third rail. But we wanted to make sure that all decisionally capable young people can get the care they need, regardless of whether they can involve, whether they're in safe homes and can involve their parents. And so there is a bill called Young People's Access to Healthcare. It is a 6761. It is an Assemblymember Reyes bill that would allow all decisionally capable young people to consent to their own healthcare. And I keep using the words decisionally capable. What that essentially means is they can understand the risks and benefits of a proposed treatment and alternatives to that treatment, including the alternative of no treatment at all. And if they can meet that standard, that's, by the way, the same standard we all need to meet when we consent to our own healthcare, then they are decisionally capable and can consent to their own healthcare. And so that's a bill that would allow young people to consent and then would also deal with some of the cost and confidentiality barriers that still stand in the way of young people receiving needed healthcare. I will hang a little tiny flag here. The cost, as Professor Ayers mentioned, is a huge barrier. And I want to flag some non-legislative efforts. So I think most folks here probably know that WPATH, which is the World Association, I should have looked up what WPATH stands for, but it is the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, I think. Melissa is nodding. I am really bad at acronyms. Just came out with their Standards of Care 8. And while those are a bit of a mixed bag, they do a whole lot to make it easier for trans folk to get the healthcare they need. And so we need to be updating New York's medical, Medicaid policy, and frankly, state policies on all sorts of things, including, say, DOCS policy. DOCS is the state prison system for the treatment of trans folk in prisons and jails, to align with SOC 8. And so that is not a bill, but that is certainly something that should be happening administratively. We are also working on legislation that is not quite ready for prime time yet. That is Jessica Gonzalez Rojas bill and Senator Cooney bill to make sure that any contractor who contracts with the state of New York has insurance coverage that covers gender affirming care for all of their employees. And that is getting around, for those of you who are healthcare nerds on this call, that is getting around a federal law called ERISA that preempts us from directly regulating self-funded insurance plans. So there are a lot of ways that New York could be making healthcare more affordable for people, both on the Medicaid side by updating the regs to conform to SOC 8, and also on the private side. And then I promised I would come back to shield laws. There are ways that we should be strengthening our shield laws. So specifically, right now our shield laws protect licensure and med-mal for medical providers, specifically people like doctors and physician's assistants. But unfortunately, the language as currently drafted leaves out a number of providers who provide gender affirming care. So for example, psychologists don't have med-mal insurance, they have psych-mal insurance. And we need to be covering their professional liability insurance as well. Speech pathologists, you get the idea. We also need to make sure that New York's family courts can take jurisdiction more easily over families that are coming here for care, or that move here because they are coming from a hostile state where their child cannot get the gender affirming care that they need. And you know, what I have heard from the family law lawyers, I am a policy lawyer, not a family law lawyer, is that, you know, if you've got a good family law lawyer, the New York court will have jurisdiction. But if you don't, because the hurdles are so high right now, the New York court might not find that it has jurisdiction. So we need to clean up our law to make it easier for someone who doesn't have an expert in this area as their lawyer to land in a New York family court rather than being sent back to, say, Texas's family court. So I just rattled through a number of issues very, very quickly, and at least on one of them, maybe not as clearly as I would have liked, but why don't I stop there?
Okay, great. Well, thanks so much, Ellie. And let me give you, we had, I think, a helpful clarifying question come up in the Q&A. One of our audience members asks, is there a difference between how public hospitals deny care as opposed to private hospitals? Is there something that can be done to address the denial of gender affirming and or reproductive care at both kinds of hospitals?
Turns out if I answer the question on mute, it will go poorly. That's a great question. So, you know, I think one of the things that was most surprising to me when we first started working on hospital transparency, I fully expected this to be an upstate problem. I fully expected it to be a religious hospital problem. And as we started collecting stories, we found that half of the stories were at secular hospitals and half of the stories came from New York City. And we do have stories from both public hospitals and private hospitals. I think the key distinction is public hospitals are directly accountable to our government. The government can actually say, without violating anybody's First Amendment religious liberty rights, public hospital,
right,
you must provide X type of care. Mm-hmm. Whereas when we get to private hospitals, unfortunately, as we know, corporations are people. I say unfortunately, on some level, it's also fortunate, right? Like the NYCLU has free speech rights, which is probably good on balance for us to be able to engage in advocacy. But, you know, there are some serious downsides to corporations or people, including that religious hospitals claim to have, and have a court that is quite sympathetic to their claims, First Amendment rights to their religious liberty to deny healthcare. I will say as a side note, or perhaps this isn't a side note, you know, organizationally, we over here at the NYCLU certainly take the position that if you are serving the public, you need to play by public rules, and religious hospitals are serving people of all faiths and of no faiths at all. And it feels dramatic, and frankly, employ people of all faiths and of no faith at all. And it feels dramatically unfair to impose the religious mores of a bureaucratic system onto its employees and the people it serves. And that's particularly challenging in regions of the state. And there are many, 1 in 6 hospital beds is in a Catholic hospital right now, in regions of the state where there are only religious hospitals as options. And so, you know, I think when I said hospital transparency might lay the groundwork for other types of solutions, there is a provider conscience bill that has been introduced. I'm not going to remember the bill number or the sponsors right now, really nailing it, that would allow, I have a spreadsheet for that though, I can get it for you pretty quickly, that would allow, or I should say would prohibit hospitals from standing in the way of providers providing accurate information about a patient's diagnosis and options, including options that are not available at that particular facility. And it is led by repro folks, would prohibit hospitals from standing in the way of a provider following their own conscience to deliver health and life and safety sustaining care in a pregnancy related emergency. So that's something like treating an ectopic pregnancy, for example. That bill is S6616 May A 5297 pollen. And I will say that there are other things, you know, the state does, we have public hospitals, right? We could think about where we are citing public hospitals so that they are being cited in communities that are otherwise care deserts, for example, right? There are all sorts of policy solutions that could come out of hospital transparency. So we really do see that as the first step. Is that responsive?
No, that's great. Thank you. So let me pause for a second since we're at the hour and say something I should have said at the beginning, which is just in case. My disclaimer, you mentioned yours, I forgot mine. Nothing I say represents the State Ethics Commission. I mean, I'm just asking questions anyway, so it's not like anybody has any confusion, but I have to say that. Let me now, since we've gone through a round of folks talking about important issues that are out there on the table, let me pause to go in a little bit of a different direction. I'll ask each of you, I'm just personally curious about this actually. I'm sure that as you do this work and as you talk to folks about these issues, there are some things you find yourself clarifying or explaining over and over again, whether it's misconceptions that people have or common things that you think people don't understand that would be useful to understand, things that people don't know that would be helpful. So I'm going to go around and just ask each of you, what are the conversations you find yourself having over and over again? And before I call on anybody individual, I'll just share two quick thoughts of my own. One of them is I remember talking to somebody who'd been an advocate for a long time who said, you know, you'd be amazed at the questions you get that people don't ask. He said he's a gay man who does legislative advocacy work. And he said, you know, I had a very senior legislator once. He said, come in my office, close the door. I want to ask you, why do you like to wear women's clothes? And no, that's a different thing. That's not, right, nothing wrong with that either, but that's not what being gay means. Just sort of very basic, fundamental stuff. I think the internet is changing that. I definitely do. This was, I think, a pre-internet story, and so maybe that's how that happened. But I also think that there's a downside to the internet, which is that there are obviously sort of organized misinformation campaigns that try to distribute misinformation. And so two of the things that I'm thinking of when I ask the question are sort of, number one, what do we mean by gender affirming care? That I think a lot of people hear that phrase and they imagine that we mean, well, we're just going straight to doing surgery on people. You know, I think Allie used the term bottom surgery, which for anybody who doesn't know means surgery that makes a person's genitals better reflect their deeply felt internal sense of their gender. But bottom surgery is something that some trans folk do. Many trans folk don't for one reason or another, some because they don't want it, others because they can't get it. And gender affirming care can mean anything, including just calling somebody by a name they say they prefer, right? Or it can mean talk therapy, where you just have the chance to sit with somebody who's going to respect you for who you are. You know, as a trans person myself, talk therapy was a really useful part of my discovery that I was trans. Nobody ever said, you know, nobody ever pressured me right, to acknowledge that I was trans. There's no organized bunch of rogue psychologists running around trying to persuade children that they're transgender. That's not a thing that happens. And the other thing is that I think a lot of folks about kids, um, I just feel like I hear this all the time. People are aware that there's, this sort of brain research that's very popular that says, well, until you're 25, your brain is still forming and you make decisions impulsively. And I think that that idea is often used to suggest that kids who are transgender can't possibly know that. They're too young to know that. And it's not just that this sort of circulates innocently. There's a very organized campaign to convince people that transgender kids frequently change their mind, when in fact the reliable studies that we have suggest that kids, the most recent one I saw was kids 3 to 12, if you who are transgender, if you check in with them 5 years later, the number who've changed their mind is 2.5%, which is astonishingly low for any medical or psychological phenomenon. Right? Human beings are just not 97.5% consistent about anything. But somehow trans kids are, that reliable when they say that they are. And I think that that's because it's not a choice. Like, what, are you goth? Right? Do you like dressing in black clothes and wearing lots of makeup? Right? Yeah, people change their mind about that. They go through a phase, but gender identity is something, I think for cisgender people, it can be hard to understand that there really is this deeply felt internal sense of who you are that transgender people have, that that if you're a cis person, maybe you can't connect that to anything directly in your experience, but kids have it, grown-ups have it. Anyway, so that's the example that comes to mind for me. But I'm curious about for each of you, what are the things that you feel like either the conversations you end up having or just basic things that you think people should know that not everybody does. I'm gonna go in a different order than I did last time. So Melissa, if I could start with you, feel free to pass off to somebody else. I don't mean to ever put anybody on the spot, but what do you think?
That'll be great. Thank you so much for the question. So according to the Williams Institute, they figure 0.75% of people are trans. Now, I don't know what their definition was. I'm not an academic. So whether it's just trans or it's TGNCI, but they figure 0.75%. So in New York State, and there are 9 million, so we're talking 100,000. And that means 8.9 million people don't really know the trans experience. And so the question comes up, the assumption is that people are already protected. Well, we already have civil rights. Why are you doing all this work? Isn't this already done? And to have to explain over and over again that when people's lives are affected, that language is very important when it comes to protecting civil rights. And certainly those of you that have legal backgrounds understand that so many of our cases that are decided in court are based upon language and protection. And so it's really important. And now we see a cohort, I would say, of mostly white gay men that feel that trans rights conversation is going to force them to lose their rights because of all the intense negative backlash. So I am seeing this on social media, and it is a concern and it is alarming. So that would be the one question. Why are you doing all this? Hasn't this already been decided? When all of us on this panel and all of our audience to know, as Allie said, there are still many things that need to be done.
Great. Faris, how about you?
Yeah, so the example that immediately comes to mind, and we were talking about media representations. So a huge roadblock for the decriminalization of sex work is just the many myths and misconceptions that people have about sex work. Number one, it's such a huge industry. There's so many different types of sex work that you could engage in, whether it's like online work or in-person work. There's just so many types. But the huge misconceptions that people have about sex work that are really just like preventing progress are that it's inherently exploitative, that, anyone who purchases sexual services is a pimp or someone who is going to abuse sex workers or is a human trafficker. And then the other huge misconception is that decriminalizing sex work would increase the likelihood of people contracting STIs, or like just in general, the general population would be more exposed to STIs in general. And there have been so many studies that have come out in different countries, in different places where they've experimented with the decriminalization of sex work. And it's just simply not the case that trafficking increases or that prevalence of STIs increase. Actually, the opposite is usually true. And I can share some resources about that. And that's why organizations like the World Health Organization and UNAIDS have come out repeatedly and said that actually criminalization of any form is not good health policy. It's not going to help sex workers keep themselves safe and keep others safe, because it's so much harder to screen people when a client is afraid of being arrested. They will not, comply with any of the requests that like sex workers have. Like, they will not be very transparent about who they really are. And in general, yeah, it would just make it very hard for sex workers to even go to their doctor and like talk to their doctors about their health concerns. So yeah, those are like the major misconceptions that I find myself having to repeat over and over again, because there's so many movies and so many TV shows that have misrepresented sex workers in this way.
Right. Great. Allie, how about you?
Sure. So I just want to feel like I always start by being like, I want to respond to a thing you said, but I do want to respond. Like, cis people also have a deeply ingrained sense of who we are. We just don't have to think about it because society just like looks at me and goes, oh yes, you are a cis, right? Like, you are a woman. My brain goes, yeah, I'm a woman. Cool. But I feel like turning that question around on a cis person, like, well, how do you know that you're a woman?
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's not, I didn't look at my private parts to figure that out, right? Like, that was something that I knew before I knew what parts I was supposed to have. Anyway, I think in terms of misconceptions, a huge one that we come up against, and I'm going to talk about carceral settings, although Faris did in the lead off. I think largely because Professor Ayers, you talked about the one that we get most in healthcare, which is, oh, you're going to give a child a vaginoplasty? No, the child's going to be like called by their name and do social transition and have talk therapy, and like maybe we'll get to puberty blockers at a certain point. But in carceral settings, I think there's just like a deep-seated misconception of what happens in a women's prison. Cis women who have committed all sorts of heinous crimes and sex crimes, who have engaged in all sorts of behaviors while incarcerated, are housed in women's facilities. There is absolutely nothing that a cis woman could do to end up housed in a male prison facility. Just would not happen. There is nothing she could do to get there. And prisons and jails have different settings to put people in, whether that's dorm style housing, whether that's individual cells, etc., to keep people safe or safer. Prison and jail are inherently unsafe places, and I should just say that, and that is true for everybody in the general population, meaning without putting people in involuntary protective custody forever and ever and ever. And they can use those tools with trans women as well in order to keep them safer in prisons and jails when they are incarcerated. And in fact, not subjecting trans women to the same way that they treat cis women who are incarcerated is just sex discrimination and gender identity discrimination. That's what it is. And I think many of my trans colleagues who work on this will say that it really feels to them like we believe trans people when they're out in the outside world, right? We've passed the Gender Recognition Act to make it easier to change gender markers. We have passed gender, thanks Melissa and many others for your decades of work on it. We've done all these things, and then suddenly when people are incarcerated, we start saying, well, you're not really a woman, right? And that's just, people don't stop being who they are because they are accused of a crime, because they committed a crime. So I think those are big ones in the criminal legal system space. And then the last one that I run up against all the time is in the healthcare space is, are people going to have too much access to healthcare? When we were doing homeless and runaway youth, we kept hearing about the mythological kid who was going to run away on Saturday morning and get a vaginoplasty on Saturday afternoon and return home on Saturday evening. And I was sort of like, step back from the, like, we're not giving small children vaginoplasties piece, because like their bodies can't even do that yet. Like physically, it's not possible to. Have you ever tried to access healthcare in this country? Like, have you ever gotten a same-day appointment on a weekend for anything, or like dealt with insurance? It's just, it's so radically out of step with the ways that things work. And of course, we know that many runaway youth are classified, looking identical to homeless youth, and are classified as runaway simply because when the program that they presented to called home and said, hey, mom and dad, your child's here, your child's safe, can they come home? Mom and dad said, oh God, I'm scared of getting in trouble. Yes, they can come home. And then told the young person themselves, you know, you can't come home, or you can come home, but you've got to wear dresses and we're going to dead name you. They probably didn't use the word dead name. Or they told the young person they could come home, and the young person said to the program, you know, I know they said I can come home, but I feel really, really unsafe going home. And so when we're talking about runaway youth, we are actually talking about people who are not running away on Saturday morning with their little, you know, bag over their shoulder, you know, on the stick, like the cartoons, and coming back on Saturday night when they, you know, are tired or hungry or whatever. But we're talking about kids who are away from home for a very long time.
Okay, thank you. And Shain.
Thank you for your question. I feel like we could have spent the entire CLE on this question alone. I wish we had time. So I'll keep it brief. I guess like some of the conversations that keep happening that I'm just like, oh my gosh, why do these conversations keep happening? Definitely around the healthcare point. I don't know why people think it is so easy and so fast, and that there are no procedural safeguards, and even and that somehow when you take your first medication that you have just like jumped off a cliff, and that everything has changed and it is all over and there is no turning back. And it's not, none of it is fast. None of it is fast at all. It's not jumping off of a cliff. It's more like wading into a lovely pool. And if that's the right water for you, great. Like keep on swimming, keep wading. But if that's not the right pool after all, well, just wade right back into shore. Like that's it. But I think for me, what's troubling is how many of the pieces of the past keep coming back in slightly repackaged arguments. I think a lot of the arguments against the queer community that we heard in the 90s are just slightly reframed and now being used against the trans community now. And I keep wondering when we're going to get past that point of like, you know, no, bisexual, it's not a phase, it's not trendy, it's not for attention. And now we're hearing that about non-binary people, and it's like, no, that's not new or trendy or a phase or for attention. So when are we going to hear kind of those past largely unsuccessful arguments that you by and large don't hear against the queer community anymore? When are we going to hear that stop against the trans community?
Yeah, no, great. I think of that all the time in the context of these sort of ideas that somehow transgender teachers shouldn't be allowed around children. You know, it's the same things that have forever been said about gay and lesbian and bisexual people, and that recurrence is really troubling. So actually, I think, and I'm being sensitive to time because we are going to run out way sooner than we expect. But that brings me to another question I was thinking of asking, which is, you know, I think that we in New York State often have a sense, we queer and LGBTQ people in New York State often have a sense that, you know, at least we don't live in states where, you know, in Florida, it's not legal for me to use a bathroom in a public facility. I think people don't always realize just how bad it's gotten, how fast in some other states where, you know, I don't feel I can go to academic conferences in certain states. People with trans kids have to worry about that. People are actively fleeing those states. You know, there's been a lot of reporting on significant numbers of people either on behalf of themselves or on behalf of their kids, just not feeling that they can be in those states anymore. And so I guess my question is sort of, there is, that sense that, I mean, we don't have that going on in New York State, but there is this national climate of backlash against trans folk and other queer folk. That's certainly part of a national movement. Several of you said you hope to avoid politics, and I think it's certainly okay to avoid politics. But I also think that as a trans person, politics doesn't seem to avoid me. It's certainly the case that there, in the context of a right-wing movement that's challenging a lot of democratic institutions, there's a corollary of that you see with a lot of authoritarian political movements, which is targeting outgroups and minoritized and marginalized populations as part of that effort. And so I guess my question is, the fact that you all work here in New York, where I'm proud that we don't have some of those laws, but how does that national climate affect your work and your thinking about your work? It's certainly the case that in New York State we have violence against trans people every day. Here in Albany, where I'm speaking to you from, we had a trans person murdered last year that I think had a big impact on the community. Everyday acts of marginalization, aggression, targeting, and hate affect the community all the time. So, we may not have the laws, but we're certainly not immune to the national climate and its effects. Let me start with Faris this time, if I could, and just to the extent you feel comfortable, talk about how that change in the national climate is affecting the work that you do.
One way I've been thinking about it is trying to remind myself to not get too comfortable, because as we're seeing nationwide, laws can always change, administrations can always change, and the same can happen in New York. And I think that some of us have probably seen that happening, especially upstate, where, especially in the last couple of years, there's just been a rise in the amount of anti-trans and anti-queer in general kinds of incidents that have been happening, whether it's like trying to initiate book bans or protesting drag story hours. So it's like happening in New York a lot more than you would think. And I think it's like a direct result of like the national climate. And so I just remind myself to like not get too comfy in New York, because stuff has always, as we've been talking about, so many communities that are overlooked. Yeah, there are so many communities that have been and are still being overlooked in New York, but also like the national climate, yeah, it does affect New York as well. And we are seeing that in the last few years, that there are a lot of hate groups in New York. And I would encourage everyone to just like be aware of what's happening in your town, because you might not even be aware that it's happening in your town. It's happening in places that you would really not expect it to be happening, including in New York City. Like I myself have been going to so many different just like grassroots level actions and counter protests of like these different hate groups, and it's happening a lot upstate too. And so just be aware of where it's happening and like where the different groups are that you could join to like try to join those counter protests, and just figure out how else you could be like supporting the trans community in your town or in your city.
Great. Allie, how about you?
Sure. And I think, New York is a big state, right? There are a lot of places in New York that look like Arkansas. And I think those of us who live in New York City in particular need to keep that in mind in our work. I think a couple of concrete examples on issues that we haven't yet talked about today. And, I feel like I get a bonus if I name as many issues as I possibly can. I don't. But comprehensive sex ed is a bill that we, and I know New Pride Agenda and Equality New York all have been supporting for a really long time. And part of the reason that we support it is because it shows LGBTQ youth that they're not alone, and it shows their classmates that they exist. Age appropriate, medically accurate. It's a bill that would require age appropriate, medically accurate LGBTQ inclusive sex ed in K through 12 comprehensive, in K through 12 public and charter schools. And we can talk more if people have questions about how it's done and how it's customized to various communities and blah, blah, blah. But our Senate sponsor wouldn't put the bill in this year. So I see Shell just dropped in the chat the bill number. It's only an assembly bill number. And the reason the Senate sponsor wouldn't put it in is because she got too much blowback in her upstate district about sponsoring the bill from folks who support book bans and oppose social and emotional learning and what they think is critical race studies. In critical race studies, y'all, happens in law school, but they think it's happening in K through 12, and they are afraid of the T word being mentioned in sex ed. And they were loud enough to scare her out of sponsoring the bill again. So it is real in the work. I think the other way that it really appears in the work is in thinking about how we do the work and who we put forward to speak and how we hold them, and support them in case there is blowback. So I know some of my partner organizations have been thinking about how do they do digital security trainings for their staff? How do they shore up their systems? The Harvard clinic, Harvard LGBTQ clinic just put out a really awesome guide called Protecting Your People that is geared at doxing the LGBTQ community and specifically the trans community, and what can employers do to support their people. When we worked with the New York State Education Department on a really frigging awesome, if y'all haven't seen it, check it out and share it with the young people in your life and with the teachers in your life, legal update on supporting transgender youth in schools. And there was a whole discussion about how are we launching this in a way that was going to be most supportive and avoid blowback, both in terms of, terrifying school districts so that they don't actually implement, or, having a bunch of bad press, but also in terms of the individual trans folk who were involved in developing that legal update. How do we keep them safe? And I don't feel like that is a discussion we've always had to have in the work in quite the same way. I know there have been times where trans folk haven't wanted to be out front in the media. We now, ACLU National talks about their plaintiffs on their cases for LGBTQ youth and families. And we used to have named plaintiffs who, were public and were talking to the press. And now we have a lot of John and Jane Does who are proceeding pseudonym words.
That's hard.
Proceeding under pseudonym because they're afraid of being attacked in their communities. It's real, and we need to protect our people in the work.
Thank you for that. Shain, I want to turn to you next. How does the national climate affect your work, particularly? I really don't like the expression "in the trenches," but maybe on the ground is better. Anyway, how does the national climate affect you?
Yeah, so thinking about direct services, separate from what our friends at Lambda and ACLU and NICLU do, that impact litigation that Allie is describing, but kind of the day-to-day, you happen to have a legal issue because of your sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, direct services. So you are not removed from the national conversation as much as we have all of these lovely New York laws buffering us. If you were born in, let's say, Oklahoma or Montana or one of those kind of states because your parents, one of which was in the military, and they just happened to be stopping through for that particular deployment at that particular time, and you were born, and now you are the one person in your family that has that Oklahoma birth certificate, but now everyone's in New York, and you want to apply for a quartered name change and a corrected gender markers on your birth certificate. Cannot get rid of the Oklahoma piece of that equation that carries with you. And I've had a lot of heartbreaking conversations with clients because they don't necessarily understand that you are forever tied to those laws, right? In terms of getting a corrected birth certificate. So if they have terrible laws about what the hurdles are to jump through to get the gender marker of choice, or perhaps the gender marker of choice like X is not even available, that is what we're stuck with, regardless of what's going on in New York. For the birth certificate piece, right? We could still correct a New York driver's license, do a lot of other helpful, wonderful things, but can't get around those state laws from a birth certificate out of state. So we are stuck in direct services and the work we're doing with the bar organizations. We are stuck being a part of this national conversation, whether we want to or not.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And Melissa.
Oh, well, I mean, thank you, Ava. You know, you talked about whether political is part of our background. Most of us work for 501c3s, which are decidedly non-political.
Sure. Yep.
And so we are all trained that, you know, when we're talking about our work, we keep it nonpartisan.
Yep.
On the other hand, I was the first trans person to run for public office here in New York. I'm an elected Democratic district leader, one of two in New York State. And so there is a part of me that is extremely political. And I luckily I'm on the DNC Trans Advisory Committee. So we meet regularly at this point. And, you know, besides the obvious thing is the rules and how we're going to do this, the two most important things are creating delegates, trans delegates around the country, and messaging. And so we're working with trans people from all over the country to make sure that we're coming up with messaging that works for people, not just here in New York and in the Northeast, but in some of those other places where there seems to be a vast array of transphobia. I mean, my take in transphobia in New York is really just more racism. It's amazing that how when we talk about our trans identity, that how many white people seem to overcome the difference of their trans identity, and yet so much of the culture that is so negatively affected are always people of color, Black and brown people. And it's very important that those of us who are in New York have that recognition that the kind of work we're doing, you know, that where I get to sit here in my little apartment and talking to all my law school friends and all the lawyers, have that recognition that what we're talking about is really racism. What our enemies see of transgender people, you know, they don't really see us. They come up with these grotesque images. And again, we've come full circle to talk about visibility. You know, media representation has become much more open, and all the work that we're doing, all the people that we are, and for all I know, half of the students that are on this call are TGNCI and will go out. I mean, I can remember when Dean Spade was a law student, and we were talking Trans 101 at law schools. You know, we're talking 25 years ago, and uh, and um, and it was very rare to see trans identified law students then, and that's changed dramatically. So we've had a good record of achievement here in New York. You know, Allie can talk about those. We all know about those counties upstate, but those counties is 50,000 people, and I live in Queens with 2.7 million people. And where the humans are going to get access to trans people and protection for trans community. Of course, I've had the benefit of the work and protection of all that. It's really important that all of us are here today to make sure that what is happening west of the Hudson River, we can use our experience and our strength, our education to make sure that in places where, you know, we forget trans people not getting their civil rights. There are people that are not getting their civil rights. And why we're here today is to make sure that our agenda can help not just trans people, but all people in the rest of the country.
So thank you for that. I have to pause to let Chell do the next CLE code. But as I do that, I just want to remind folks, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A so that we can share them with the panelists. We will do a bit of that. And while folks are thinking of questions, Chell, why don't you go ahead?
Yes. Hopefully you're paying attention. The second code word for attorneys looking for CLE credit is access. You should be seeing that on your screen. The second code word to put on your affidavit is access.
Okay, great. So with that, what I'd like to do now, if I could, since we're going to run short on time real quick, is to do a sort of lightning round. I want to do one question of mine, forgive me, and then we have one question in the Q&A that I definitely want to share with people, but I want to ask people to keep this one real short, 30 seconds or less. I know that's impossible, but try. Because as Melissa mentioned, they're really I think are some TGNC law students listening, and hopefully who will be able to watch the video if they're not there. What advice would you all give in terms of people who are trans, whether they're out, not out, people who are questioning, they're not sure, who are thinking about a career and what it means to be trans, gender non-conforming, or intersex in the workplace? Any advice at all? Let me, let's see, this time I want to start with Allie, if I could.
Oh gosh, it's not enough time to think.
I know, I'm sorry.
Find your people. And that doesn't necessarily mean find other trans people, though I hope you do, right? To Shain's point, like, I hope you're not the only trans person in your workplace, but find your people, whether that's other trans folk, whether that's cis allies who will listen to you and who will support you when you need internal advocacy in your organizations. Unfortunately, too many trans folk are still trailblazing right now. And the other is be confident in who you are. You are the expert in your own experience. And, you know, find the folks who are going to hand you the megaphone and the microphone, and also the folks who are going to speak, you know, and amplify your voice, especially when it's doesn't feel safe for you to.
Great, thank you. Faris, I'm going to turn to you next, and I'm pretty sure that you've been our least heard from panelist so far. So actually, if you want to break the 30-second rule, you have my blessing.
Let me see. I'm only out of law school for like 2 years, so I guess I have like a good amount of thoughts about this.
Yeah.
So number one, if you're like a law student and you're just starting out and there's very few like trans students like around you, it might change way sooner than you think. So don't feel too bad. So for example, when I was in law school, I had just like a handful of trans students who I know of who are around me. And then the very next year, because we did like a concerted effort to try to increase the amount of trans students in the upcoming class year, so many more trans people came like the following year and then the following year. So like as Allie was saying, like definitely find your people, do the outreach to whoever you can, who you see who is trans, but also make sure that you're also inviting other trans people who might not know that you're there, and invite them in because they're also looking for you. And don't be afraid to reach out to other trans people who are maybe already lawyers or who are your professors. Just talk to them and ask them for support. It just feels good to know that there's another trans person there. And don't, like, if someone asked me for advice as a trans person who was a student or was just starting out as a lawyer, I would have no problem talking to them about literally anything that they wanted. And I'm sure none of you all would have a problem with that either. So definitely just reach out to everyone that you can and invite other trans people to where you are, because if you're feeling bad about feeling lonely, like you can change that as well. And also follow your gut. If you have a bad feeling about a person, whether they're trying to hire you or a coworker or anything like that, just follow your gut, because you might be right about whether or not these people would be able to advocate for you in case something happens, and you really just shouldn't like underestimate the likelihood that something can come up and you will need your coworkers or other students or even your professors, anyone. You would need anyone to advocate for you, because it really feels bad to do that alone, and it really feels bad to be, you know, in conflict with someone who's working with you. And so definitely follow your gut. If there's something that feels bad in like an interview, you are probably right. And also reach out to people who have already worked there and ask them specifically about what is your experience working here as a trans person or a trans person of color or an immigrant trans person. Because I'm sure, like I said, those people would be more than happy to share their experiences.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Faris. I strongly second everything Faris just said, and what Allie said too. Melissa, how about you?
What was the question again?
And any advice, 30 seconds of advice for trans law students?
Okay, the first thing you have to do is get a cat. Your cat will love you. You don't have to walk them in the rain. It's very, very helpful. And they'll just scratch you. It won't be that bad. But if that can't work, I mean, all of us are here because we all want to change the world. And the best way to do that is by being authentic. You know, it's really important. You know, you could wait till you're much older, like I did, and become a homeless drug addict, or you can really take that leap for authenticity. It's so much better if you're pure in your heart to go out there in the world. You'll be taken more seriously. The mission will be relevant. The passion will be real. And if you're authentic, you'll be impossible to ignore.
Okay, great. And Shain.
Yeah, these are all great points. Of course, I'm going to say join a bar association, preferably join my bar association. We're one of the oldest and largest LGBTQ plus affinity bar associations in the entire country, and that is a way to find your people, to develop that authentic voice in litigation, to ask the hard questions about behind closed doors, about where are safe places to work, and how can you dress in a way that's still affirming and yet deemed professional, with all of the problematic concepts that are built into that. So I think that the jumping off point in the quick amount of time that I have, I would say, is to join the right bar association.
Okay, great. So so now I want to turn to some questions from the Q&A. I hope people will feel free to keep adding them as we go. But the question that I see right now, or Chell, did you want to why don't you do this? Yeah.
Sure. We have a question from somebody speaking of transgender youth in schools and talking about inclusive curricula. There's also been quite a bit of blowback against inclusion of transgender and gender nonconforming kids in school sports. Like, for example, this is not in the question. You know, in the federal House of Representatives, they did actually pass a resolution that would amend Title IX, defining sex as recognized solely based on reproductive biology and genetics at birth. That has not gone anywhere in the Senate this year. But the question is, you know, how can we, you know, whether we're allies or we share these experiences and identities, you know, address what is, you know, considered gender essentialism in this kind of blowback when people we talk to are friends or family. So maybe even not in the legal setting.
Great. Does anybody want to? I'll just ask for volunteers instead of calling on everybody, I think. Does anybody want to take this question?
I can start. I was digging to see if I had talking points and I didn't find them in the time allotted. But, you know, I think going back to why kids play sports, you know, most kids don't play sports because they're going to be Olympic athletes or Major League Baseball players. For the most part, there are some exceptions, but because they want to make friends and they want to get exercise and they enjoy the game. And they want to get the skills. I can't believe I'm saying this, by the way, y'all. I was a theater kid. I fucking hate sports. Sorry. Again, cursing. I need to maybe tone it down. This is being recorded. Anyway, you know, and because they want to learn skills like teamwork, and they want the camaraderie that comes with it. And trans kids need that just as much as cis kids need it. Fact of the matter is that different kids have different athletic abilities. You know, we represent trans girls who ran races and didn't win. You know, they were not, ACLU National represents, right? They weren't placing first. I can remember as a cis girl beating a cis boy in a running race, which is really ridiculous if you've ever seen me run, that I could beat anybody at all. But it's like, there is not the same biological essentialism when we're talking about school sport like that. It's so individual, and that's not what people come here for. Like, they're coming to learn teamwork and to be part of a team and to get exercise. And I think going back to why we play is a place to start, and then just, you know, sort of taking on that myth of, yes, we all want the sports teams to be competitive, and they still will be, because this individual person's ability, it just is what it is.
Great. Anybody else want to?
Yeah, the people that hate women in sports have decided the enemy of women in sports are not the men that never funded, but the 2 or 3 transgender girls around the country that have actually succeeded in this. It's such a bizarre juxtaposition that there are so few instances of this. I think the Olympics have now changed their rules to prevent transgender women from competing in the women's categories. I think people have invented a stereotype over what women in sports is, and our enemies have been able to run with it and make it work. You know, the idea that the people with the least power in the culture need to be punished by the more powerful is, we're talking we're talking a belief system against common sense and logic, and common sense and logic in this day and age seems to always come in second place.
So I'll just since I want to make sure to leave time for Judge Marnin's closing remarks, which I'm very excited to hear. I also want to just say that I think that, you know, I know that there are a lot of folks who hear questions about trans girls in sports and think like, oh, that sounds like a complicated issue. I would say two things. One is, if you've never had a concern about women's sports before, maybe just sort of hold back, do some reading, you know, but maybe you don't need to jump in there if this is your first concern about women's sports. And the other is to ask yourself, you know, what is the concern exactly? Because we keep seeing these sort of, you know, trans women have been banned from beauty competitions. Trans women, I think just yesterday, were banned from darts. All right, is that really because there's a biological advantage? Or is it because there's an organized movement to paint trans people as predators who are trying to sneak into women's locker rooms? Okay, that's a very negative note to end on, so I don't want to end there. What I guess I want to say to stop is that I think that the group of folks we've assembled here who have such wonderful experience, I'm really grateful to all of you for sharing your insights. And I think that for me, one of the great joys of discovering I was trans, which for me happened quite late in life, it was in my early 40s, was discovering this community of folks who have so much to offer and who I think are helping people understand that gender is not what some of us grew up thinking it was, that it's vastly more complicated and more interesting than any of us knew. And so for lawyers who are not trans, who are here, I'm grateful to you for taking the time to learn about this. And I hope that one of the takeaways is, you know, that as we learn new ways to use pronouns to help people feel included, new and more complicated understandings of gender, new facts about our kids that we might not have known before, new ways to help them, that the message is not, oh no, here's more work that I have to do, you know, just to talk to people in the workplace. It's, here's an opportunity to learn more about how beautifully unique each person is, how many human experiences there are that we didn't know we had the opportunity to learn and to grow from. And I think our panelists have been a wonderful example of that. So I'm so grateful to all of you. And I wish we could continue the conversation, but at this point, I'm very excited to ask Judge Marnin if he would magically make himself appear to our webinar guests. Thank you for that. And Judge Marnin, I'll turn it over to you with many thanks.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon. It's truly an honor to be here today. I want to first thank Albany Law School for hosting this event, and particularly thank you to Shain Miller for their efforts coordinating this program. I have the privilege and somewhat daunting task of offering closing remarks for what has been an excellent three-part series. Now, I have no crystal ball, but here is what I want to say about the future and looking forward. I remain optimistic about the future for transgender, gender non-conforming, non-binary, and intersex folks. I, of course, say this with an asterisk. As you heard today, there is work, hard work, that still remains to secure our rights. And if we've learned nothing else from our sibling organizations and movements, we know that vigilance is essential. I can't think of any group that can confidently say, we've won these legal rights and now we're done. And I'm quite certain that we will not be able to say that either. And still, so what is the evidence that I have that our future is so bright? Let me offer three things to you today. One, I'm going to start with our youth. Trans, intersex, non-binary, and gender non-conforming youth are coming out. Exponentially more young people are coming out all over the state and all over the country. The number of young people who identify as trans has nearly doubled in recent years, according to a June 2022 Williams Institute report. And our youth are fierce, and they have expectations, demands that those of us who came before them can barely imagine. These expectations that they have, I would argue, reflect the successes of the folks you've heard from on these panels and others around the country. They expect their teachers, family members, friends, and others they encounter to get their names and pronouns right. They expect to access healthcare. They expect to play sports. They expect a restroom to be available to them. And they expect to be treated with respect. In New York, laws like the Dignity for All Students Act have made those expectations imaginable. Now, I'm not saying their expectations are met every time, and in every place, and by every person. And that is most definitely not to say that they are not sometimes disappointed, profoundly so in some cases. But what is remarkable is that they are coming out younger and naming and embracing their identities. 2, the parents. Why else do I think the future is so bright? The parents of young trans, non-binary, gender non-conforming, and intersex folks, most of them straight, are also coming out as parents of trans kids. And they're not trying to fix or change their children. Rather, they are occupying the front lines of battle on their children's behalf. And while there are, of course, still parents who don't support their queer children, more than half the states in the country now have laws that ban so-called conversion therapy for minors, including New York. I'm also thinking about the parents who reached out to me when my appointment to the bench was announced. I received emails from parents in New York, across New York, not just New York City, and from across the country, who conveyed to me how my appointment by the governor not only inspired them and their children, but reassured them that their trans kids really could aspire to be whatever they dreamed, and that being trans would not be a barrier. These parents and even grandparents, most of whom previously never thought about or considered any kind of LGBTQIA issues or rights, let alone question the gender binary, are giving their time, their energy, and money to the cause. They're advocating in schools, libraries, and in state houses across the country. And they're not going to stop. I believe more and more will be coming out as their children do. I'm also reminded that coming out has long been one of the central and most effective strategies of the gay rights movement, arguably instrumental in the success of marriage equality. Coming out has been identified as the underlying social engine of most of the opinion change that has led to political and legal victories. According to a 2016 Pew study, nearly 9 in 10 US adults, that's around 87%, said they knew someone who was gay or lesbian. Far fewer back in 2016, 30%, said they knew someone who's trans. By 2022, that number had grown to 44%, and anecdotally, that number has continued to grow. We and our allies have been coming out. We've been telling our stories and centering our voices, and this toothpaste is not going back into the tube. And finally, 3, lack of understanding is fixable. Folks are educable. Among the pieces of good news in New York is that we already have a lot of good laws and regulations. Is there room for improvement? Absolutely. But there is more than a solid foundation, and part of the law's function is to educate people. Not only do we have the Dignity for All Students Act and gender, we have groundbreaking new laws that make New York a safe haven for the trans community by ensuring New York will protect trans youth, their parents, and their doctors. You heard already today, New Yorkers have the option to choose X as a gender marker on their driver's license. And there's a new law that ensures that non-binary New Yorkers can fully participate in our democratic system by requiring political parties to change their rules to permit people who do not identify as a binary gender to be elected to party positions. Just a week ago, the governor signed into legislation a law prohibiting long-term care facilities and their staffs from discriminating against any resident on the basis of their actual or perceived sexual orientation, gender identity or expression, or HIV status. The LGBT Bar Association's Law Notes, a tremendous resource for the latest updates in LGBTQ law, is being added to the resources available to incarcerated individuals. And today you've heard about important new legislation on the horizon. Now, to be clear here, laws are tools. They are not magic wands. They require people, lawyers, aspiring lawyers, and other advocates to use them to maximize their impact. Like any other tool, they don't do so much until you pick them up. But an underlying theme that we've heard in all three of these sessions is that so much of what folks are seeing and hearing is that people, whether judges, the law clerks in the courts, teachers in the classrooms, employers, or healthcare providers, want to know how to do it right. And honestly, I think that is true of most people. And we have the ability to distinguish between the people who seek to do us harm and those who just don't know yet how to do it right. And I truly believe that the uninformed outweigh the bigoted, and we know how to inform the uninformed. We've done it to pass this good legislation. We've done it with CLEs like this one and other resources, and we'll build on that. Trans and intersex, non-binary and gender non-conforming folks don't need to do it on our own. Our allies, parents, family members, faith leaders, advocates are prepared to follow our lead. And you know what? Sometimes folks are still going to get it wrong because people are going to people. They're going to forget a pronoun. They're not going to remember a name. There's going to be a glitch in a system that spits out the wrong information. And no, this is not okay or ideal. But what it is an opportunity. It's an opportunity to model how to apologize, how to correct yourself, and how to move forward with respect, and to teach others how to do that too. Is there and will there continue to be backlash? Absolutely. That backlash reflects our successes, as Melissa said earlier. If we weren't winning, there would be no motivation for the harmful laws that have been introduced around the country. Now, let me end with a bit of my own story. And to be crystal clear here, my story is my story. I have and continue to benefit from a whole variety of socioeconomic, educational, and particularly race privileges. We so often hear the stories of folks who have experienced profound discrimination and abuse, often at the hands of the state, whether law enforcement, courts, our public schools, prisons, and hospitals. And we need to continue to hear those stories that cry out for justice. And there are other stories too. To paraphrase my friend Bear Bergman, I think pride serves us better as a movement, naming, claiming, and celebrating the things that make us special and different. So I'm going to tell you a bit of my own story today. I transitioned in 2009. I was an associate at a boutique firm here in New York City. It was a progressive firm, and I had just successfully encouraged the partners to develop a transition policy as a best practice, modeled on some of Jill Weiss's good work. And it worked. I expected my colleagues to act right, and for the most part, they did. If I'm being honest, though, I was less confident about our clients, the courts, and opposing counsel. But you know what? They rose to the occasion without exception. I will always believe that part of what made it go as smoothly as it did was that part of the plan we put together included the firm communicating, educating really, within and outside of the firm, what were essentially instructions about how to act right, how to address me, where to get questions answered, hint, not by asking me. Opposing counsel were gracious. A federal court judge sent me a handwritten congratulatory note and reaffirmed that I was always welcome in his courtroom and chambers, even to just say hello. Despite that, relatively speaking, seamless experience I had when I transitioned, even just a few years ago, it was unimaginable to me that I could be appointed by the governor to the bench. But here I am. And not only was I appointed by the governor and confirmed by the New York State Senate, when I was in Albany this summer for to sign my oath card and to be sworn in, Albany Law School sent a representative to attend, and Albany's mayor issued a proclamation. At my New York City community swearing-in ceremony, Judge Roz Richter, one of the first openly gay judges to sit on the appellate court in New York, noted just before administering the oath, not only was a trans judge's swearing in unimaginable until recently, it most certainly would not have been celebrated and attended by the governor, the New York State Attorney General, my court's presiding judge, and several other elected officials and family members. And just last week, at the annual Judicial Friends event, where Chief Judge Wilson was being honored, in remarking on how the diversity of the court has grown, he noted that, quote, last summer, Seth Marnin became the first transgender judge in the Unified Court System and the first transgender man to serve as a judge anywhere in the country. I say this all not to brag, although I am extraordinarily grateful and proud to serve, but to say this: we have come a very long way, and the future is bright. There is, of course, a ways to go, and there is no shortage of work to be done. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judge. And thanks to everybody. Jill, do you want to wrap us up?
Sure. Well, thank you all very much for joining us this afternoon. Thank you, Judge Martin, for those remarks, and all of the speakers here too for encouraging us to be forward-looking. As a reminder, for those of you who are looking for CLE credit, you have a couple of forms that you need to submit to our colleague Lisa Rivage by email. Those forms have been sent electronically to you, but I will send an email with those again. And I'd like to pass it off to Judge Stein to close this up.
Yes, I'd like to echo Chel's remarks and thank Judge Martin for not only those inspiring and encouraging words, but also for his commitment to being present for our other programs in this series and for adding really so much to it. And many, many thanks to Professor Ayers for her expert facilitation of the panelists, and to each one of the panelists who brought such important information and perspectives to this discussion. And finally, to Chel, who brings it all together and puts it all together and does an exquisite job of doing that. So I look forward to seeing and working with all of you as we continue down the path. Thank you.